Welcome to the Australian Medical Council seminar on the draft Aboriginal, Torres, Strait Islander and Māori accreditation standards for primary medical education. My name is Philip Gu. I'm the CEO of the Australian Medical Council and I'm going to chair today's session. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal and Jagera nations as the traditional custodians of lands on the University of Queensland where we're meeting today. And offer my respects to their elders past and present and to emerging leaders. I'd also like to offer our respects to all Indigenous people who are here with us today and their ongoing relationship with land, sea, sky and every community. Ka mihi mahana kia koutou katoa. E tēnei wā mō tēnei hui. No mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. So welcome to our meeting today. We have three professors on stage with me. They had gone into the bar but took the wrong turn and ended up here. So we have Sean Ewan, who is the current chair of the AMC's Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Māori Committee and is also a director of the AMC. Sean is also Deputy Vice Chancellor and Vice President Education at Griffith University. We have Jeff McColl, the current chair of MedSAC and Deputy President of the Australian Medical Council, and Jeff is Executive Dean, Faculty of Medicine at the University of Queensland. And we have Suze Pitama, the original chair of the AMC's Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Māori Committee. And Suze is Dean and Head of Campus at the University of Otago, Christchurch. So I have a couple of introductory comments that I'd like to just make to set the scene for today. First, really a conversation that Suze and I had back almost 2 years ago in early 2021 when Suze phoned me from Christchurch about the AMC's process for developing the scope and the consultation process for the medical school standards. She talked to me about the importance of engaging initially with Indigenous stakeholders such as AEDA and Lyme, and it changed the whole approach of the AMC's process because it also was a significant factor and a recognition that self-determination is a key element in terms of the development of these standards. And secondly, I've been involved in regulation and accreditation now for 18 years. During that time, there's been a lot of rhetoric around the phrase closing the gap. And there have even been some initiatives about closing the gap. However, I would argue that if you want to make change, you have to start with standards. And these draft standards that we're talking about today address the need for health equity, they address the need for cultural safety, and the need to remove racism from our sector. Feel free to send questions through on the chat function during the presentations and discussion that we're going to have, and we will have some time to address those at the later part of this meeting. I'm now going to pass over to Sean and the rest of the panel. So Sean, thank you.
Thanks, Philip, for the introduction. We might jump straight into it and do a bit of scene setting. So I wonder if Jeff and Suze, you could talk a bit about the context of the development of all of the standards and how the Indigenous standards have sat within that. Jeff, as Chair of MedSAC, you've led this process?
Yes, been involved. So under the national law, we accredit medical programs both in New Zealand and in Australia through the use of standards and graduate outcome statements. And over the continuum of medical education from entry to practice programs, medical schools through pre-vocational and specialist. And each of them have standards and graduate outcome statements. And on a regular basis, the AMC reviews those standards and graduate outcome statements. For medical schools, that was a process that had perhaps been delayed a little bit for a variety of reasons, and we were working on standards that were drafted and implemented in 2012. So there had been a tweak of those standards about 2015, 2016, really just to kind of ensure that they align to the contemporary legislation. But when I took over as MedSAC, it was quite clear that this was a time to examine the sort of underpinning principles, taxonomy, and kind of the approach to these standards. And The Australian Medical Council were very keen to do this. And at the same time, the pre-vocational standards were being looked at. And again, there was a sense of wishing to change those, not by a shuffle, but by a step and trying to do things in a different way. So the AMC has really altered the way it's approached the revision of these standards and graduate outcome statements over the last couple of years. And, I'm very proud of what we've been able to achieve, because I think the voice of those stakeholders who are so important in the final product of these standards have been heard, and in particular, the Indigenous voice. So the process began in 2020 formally. This begins with a sort of case for change. What are the broad areas that we feel needed to be examined within the standards and within the graduate outcome statements? And this was done, both internally. We'd reflected on the application of those standards over many years as they were used within medical schools. And look, pretty early on, a broad lens of social accountability, I think, came out, a sense that we needed to examine this. And simultaneously, the Australian Medical Council, through its strategy, had established the Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Māori Committee, and Suze was the inaugural chair and Sean followed. And so we needed to think, with this broad lens of social accountability, how do we contact and consult with a broad range of stakeholders to allow us to revise these standards in a meaningful way. So over the last couple of years, we have had a considerable amount of consultation, a process which I think Suze will describe in terms of an Indigenous voice, but from medical students, from the health services, from doctors themselves, from many other parties, other health professional groups. And we've got a set of standards that are significantly altered. We've changed the taxonomy, we've simplified it from a sort of 8 standard to a 6 standard. We've kind of made sense of the logic. But I think as we discuss the Indigenous standards, there's the sense check, I think, is there, the articulation and alignment, and this sort of view of social accountability, I think, is writ large in what we've done. But Suze, I might ask you to perhaps talk a little bit about the important role of the voice and how that voice was heard.
That's a great question. And I guess before I came onto the AMC, I've had, alongside with you, Sean, a really long history with the Lyme Network. And previous renditions of the AMC Accreditation standards, the Lyme Network was engaged and had an advocacy role around what the AMC standards were for Indigenous health, but not a lot of opportunity to have impact, especially whether things featured in the standards or the notes, and things have changed over the years. I think with this rendition of the AMC work, what was exciting is that the AMC had mandated and we had the Indigenous the Indigenous Committee to actually lead and take a stance at Indigenous leadership on this. And I think that was one of the key differences. And in that Indigenous leadership really was an opportunity for the committee to actually say, the AMC has a whole lot of deadlines that it needs to meet, and you raised a really good point. At the same time, the pre-vocational standards were being looked at. And because the our Indigenous stakeholder groups are quite small and often the same people, like Te Ora, Aida, and the medical education experts within the med schools, that would mean a double up in AMC consultation. So we'd be hitting pretty much the same people up for 2 different types of documents, and we just don't have that capacity. So it was the opportunity to consolidate the piece of work and actually really look at, if we're really serious about Indigenous standards, what might constructive alignment look like between our undergraduate and our postgraduate programs? And I think that was really, really exciting. And then the second thing was, as discussed by Philip, was going, if we used an Indigenous approach to the consultation, it meant that we had to talk to Indigenous stakeholders first. Because in the past it's gone out to all stakeholders, and Indigenous stakeholders have had to mainly do individual submissions in, and then there wasn't an Indigenous expert group within AMC to navigate that. So the opportunity we took is to work directly with groups like Aida, Te Ora, Lime, to allow them to critique our work first, to take on board their Indigenous expertise and their voices within the standards, and then bring that back to an Indigenous committee and to work them through on how they might look, and then to submit them back into the process. So quite different than previous renditions.
And off the top of your head, what were some of the critiques that you might have got from Indigenous leadership?
That we needed to go further, so that there's been small increments, which I think is a real accolade to the AMC, by the way. But I think everyone could see that the AMC had an appetite to push further, and the Indigenous communities and stakeholders have been waiting a while to push it further. So I think holding the medical schools and the pre-vocational training programs to higher account. We're slowly increasing our workforce, and there is a call, our inequities haven't been addressed, and so there is a call to really use medical education as a vehicle to address health inequities. And I think stakeholders were really keen for us to push more forward so that we can see the results in 3 to 5 to 10 years of the impact of these standards.
So Jeff, why do you think we're at a position for step change now where we might not have been 10 years ago? Sue's talked about Indigenous stakeholders saying you want to go further. We've probably been saying that for quite a while. Why now?
It is interesting because, I think you and I share the beginnings of this, where the Medical Deans of Australia, then called CDAMS, created a framework. I think that was around 2004. And that was the first step change where, to be honest, we went from zero to something. And we had a lot of growth, I think, in the maturity of this approach. Wasn't always Indigenous-led, I have to say, but there was a very strong growth. I think, from my perception, we then had a plateau where we'd achieved quite a bit under those sets of standards, under using that framework, and the framework was in a way, it was a self-analysis. You had to reflect on what your school was doing. It was a very clever way of doing it. And then we sort of flattened out, and I was watching, as the chair of MedSAC, conditions around Indigenous health that I'd call perpetual. They just seem to never change. And we were accruing those, more and more. And at the same time, so we're seeing that signal that we perhaps lost some of the impetus with flattered. And then at the same time, AMC, I think there was a step change, with Philip coming in as the CEO, a real reflection on how our engagement with Indigenous groups worked, a governance change with the development of the Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Māori Committee, that we were ready for that next step. Acknowledging that maybe we'd lost some of the momentum, acknowledging that we were now in a place in which we had graduated a very large number of Indigenous medical students. I mean, obviously far more in New Zealand than in Australia, but, we were growing. I think we've got about 200 Aboriginal medical students in Australia at the moment. And how many Māori students would we have?
Oh, that's a good question. Throughout the whole system?
Yeah, a large number.
That's a good question.
A larger number.
Large number, maybe about 600.
So that we have... an aligned opportunity of perhaps engaging with that group. We had, I think, a kind of institutional view, that we were ready for this. And I think, MedSAC at the time, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander and Māori Committee, I think the voices of Paparangi Reid, we were at a place where, we need to listen in a very different way. And that was beginning the conversation. I mean, we've never had a standard drafted by an Indigenous group, drafted and then coming to us for our comment. I mean, that's what literally happened. And I think that was a big move and worked very well.
You've talked about, we've colloquially referred to the Indigenous standards, but my read of the standards is it would be hard to pick out. It's infiltrated lots of the standards, and I wondered if you had any reflection on that in terms of the process and how the standards have evolved and developed.
Yes, that was a big
It's
part
a
of the
big part of the
process.
big, yeah, that's right. They were not integrated before.
Yeah, it was like, so when we think about the standards, it's not just, what we realised that it's not just how they appear, it's how they're assessed. And so we had a lot of toing and froing. Jeff and I had a lot of conversations about, do we integrate them through the new six components of the new standards, or should they be standalone? And some of that was driven by how they're assessed. When you're on an assessing committee and you go in, so how do we ensure that the Indigenous expertise is the person assessing the standards? So it was a really huge conversation. And where we got to was and. So the need to integrate them so that medical schools can see how they map to cultural safety and cultural competency, and the opportunity for when we utilise these as an assessment tool for Indigenous expertise to actually be able to take the Indigenous standards as a whole package, so not separate them as such. So we want to do and. So integrate as well as be able to assess on their own. Hence why they look like the way they do. But it was a really good, rigorous discussion.
It was. And look, it took us a lot of thinking. And the other thing is, of course, we didn't have a complete set of standards that are related to Indigenous health. You know, we had bits and pieces of it. There was no assessment standard, for instance, that related to it. So if you now look through, it's probably 12 or 14 direct standards that relate to Indigenous health and others that kind of relate. They are through all six. Talk to an Indigenous lead in many, curriculum design, in assessment. Evaluation is going to be an interesting one. We've that's the final standard, and I think is one where we probably do have a lot more to do. But yes, we have gone for this sort of sense. But the groups will go and evaluate the medical schools. That Indigenous expertise, we need to then make the process of that week with the school or whatever it happens to be, that there is that sense of leadership across the entire thing. And that will be new for us, because quite often the teams that come along, we did it the other way. You would have been allocated standard 6 or 2 and 6. Now I think if you're part of a team, all of those standards, and so it's how we render the product and how we consider the philosophy of what's the approach. Because what had concerned me was that in Standard 1, we really need to say, well, what are the values that drive the approach that we're saying? And we're encouraging the school to have that vision around Indigenous health. And that's not always a part of the thing that's in front. And that was in Standard 2. It was kind of a bit lost in a whole lot of governance.
That's right. And because this is a really important discussion, because how we execute the standards, how we monitor and measure them, are as important as the wording of the standards. And, there's been experiences of Indigenous assessors that have gone in and assessed medical schools but not had access to, not being part of writing up the Indigenous standards because of the way that it was previously done. And so it's a really, it's a real, accolade to Jeff and his team to be open to think about changing the current process and protocol so that we can put the action plan behind how the standards are being developed.
So as I'm listening to your talk, I'm hearing some things that I probably wouldn't have heard in 2004. You talked about Biggs's constructive alignment. You've both talked about assessment driving learning, not explicitly but implicitly. So are you telling me that the standards are actually driven by some educational theory in the development?
Oh, imagine that.
And if they are, the next question is actually about what you've just touched on, leadership and the operationalisation of the standards, the growing expertise of the Indigenous health workforce and so on. And I invite you both to comment on that.
Well, I think in parallel with some of the things we've talked about in Indigenous health, the expertise in medical education, I think, has been increasingly professionalised.
Across the board.
Overall, that's right. And I often am quoted. I don't know where the medical education workforce comes from. Sometimes, it comes from many different sources. It's those individuals are not always medically qualified. In fact, they shouldn't be. But if I look back to when I entered this, in the late 1990s, it was something doctors did kind of on the side. There was not, the professional educators were very, very thin on the ground. Over the last 20 years, there has been this professionalisation of it. We've got some extraordinary people designing and implementing programs. And so, yes, as probably educators, I think all three of us have come from a background of pedagogy and research and application. We are in a different world, and I think those educators don't necessarily bring along those discipline kind of fences that we would have had before. Because what we're saying around the Indigenous health standards is, this is a part of everything we do. It may not be part of every curriculum element, but it's a thought that connects to everything we do. And to be honest, there are many curriculum elements where we would probably be served incredibly well. So no, I think they do have a stronger pedagogical focus. We've been sort of getting there over the years, but I think this has been refined. But, their application in the medical schools, I think there is a very professional workforce and a growing Indigenous medical education workforce. It's probably not entirely there right now, but I think it's going to grow quite rapidly, actually.
Yep, I agree. I think in 2004, was that when we had the first Lyme, I think, and maybe the second?
4 or 6.
Around that
Early
time.
2000s, this century.
Yes, when I think as an emerging discipline, Indigenous medical education, has since now in 2022, is that we have grown in capacity. And I think in that growing of capacity, in that development of evidence, in that development of publications and good practice guidelines, that actually we have got the educational theory to want to push forward to move the evidence into practice. So moving beyond just our health and equities data to actually medical education evidence that says this isn't actually where we should be, here's what best practice looks like. Now let's utilise the AMC standards as scaffolding to support medical schools achieve that best practice. And I think, when I look at Indigenous medical education throughout the world, Australia and New Zealand is really well placed to be champions of this to the whole world. And, I think about at the last Lyme, I'm just using the Lyme network because it is a medical education span, is looking at how people from the United States, from Canada, from Taiwan, a lot of other Indigenous communities around the world are coming to Australia and Aotearoa because we are advancing this in a really key way that's not had the breathing space. And I think that's what's great about this partnership with the AMC and Indigenous medical educators, is that accreditation provides the space to actually continue to push forward with putting evidence into practice.
Changing the conversation a bit, Suze, Jeff mentioned values earlier, and we've talked a bit about educational theory and so on, but how have Māori, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander values informed both the process and what some of the outcomes might be?
I think Indigenous values have informed the process by pushing pause on the AMC usual processes and having to work with the other directors and the broader AMC team who work on pretty tight timeframes to go, this won't work. Because Indigenous medical educators have really high workloads, so the kind of time turnover was never going to work. Also that we wanted to have the opportunity to allow communities of practice to get together and to actually have time to contemplate what we were talking about, but actually also build trust in the Indigenous Committee. And the tricky thing about the Indigenous Committee is that we had never, under my chairmanship, had a face-to-face meeting. So the cultural values that would normally drive our Indigenous relationships across the ditch between Aotearoa and Australia had to happen on a different time frame because we were using Zoom, which was slowed everything down. So we were creating this new culturally safe space within the AMC to talk about accreditation using a virtual platform. And so we had to determine what Indigenous values look like in that space, and it was really hard to discuss strategy in that space as Indigenous peoples, and also, and I say peoples deliberately, because we're so diverse in our communities coming from all over Australia, different backgrounds as well as Aotearoa. And so I think the first thing was pushing pause. The second thing was working out as Indigenous communities how we pulled together this relationship to be able to do strategy during the midst of COVID, where the majority of us were also tied with COVID response. So that was an extra added pressure, and where our values were having to redesign to the pandemic. And so we had these two crises going on, like do we get on board where the AMC's at now? And how do we do that at the same time as this pandemic? I'm just saying that because the context of this has had a huge impact on those Indigenous stakeholders, because everyone was quite busy doing other things, especially during Alpha and Delta. And then I think the next thing was to work closely with the AMC team to get their confidence up that the Indigenous process, which worked at a totally different time frame than how they were used to doing things, would achieve the same results and actually better results. If we could work it our way, which was relationships first, so that we could earn trust, so that people could feel open to give us the true feedback that we needed to refine the process. And so I think our values were really process-driven around, and that way, I think that's how they got embedded. And then what was great is that, to me, as the chair, is that when the feedback came in, it was clear and concise and solution-focused. And so then we were able to refine it with all our stakeholders' voices and then go back to our stakeholders and say, is this what you meant? And then have them further critique us. So when it went out to all of the medical schools, all the Indigenous medical educators that were going to be impacted by this had already seen them, which was quite a different value process than how it used to be done. And so that they were in a culturally safe space and they weren't having to run around by themselves to try and respond and react to the AMC, that the AMC had already taken in their voice and their values and their perspectives before it went to their mainstream colleagues.
And how did you experience this, Jeff, both as chair of MedSAC and the MedSAC committee more broadly?
Look, it did challenge our processes. We are driven by a kind of linear forward narrative and, dates and times and things. And, it became clear to me, and it's conversations with Susan, then something that it was about the product. It was not about the timing. It was about the quality of what we were doing. And look, there were tensions in this where, our standards review working group was, looking at standards drafted and they're looking and they don't, the voice wasn't quite what they wanted. And, we had to decide that it was okay that a set of standards may appear to have a lot of different voices in it. Where, often I think the drafting of, maybe 2012 was, it's always the same length of sentence, it has the same kind of verbs, and all of these, and I mean, you were there and watched some of these but in the end, it was driven by a sense of goodwill, and at times, there were probably some rough edges, but we were all heading in the same direction. And yes, it's taken us a bit longer, but the quality of the product, and I mean, it actually helped all of the standards, because there was a lot of other things where you go, oh gosh, that probably needs to be thought about. And, I think what we've sent out for consultation now, is a very refined product, and the feedback we're getting is actually very positive. The accolades begin. I mean, there's always a but it's a very positive one.
So I wanted to get to the product. So we've talked a fair bit about the process, the values bit in that, which seem to be COVID challenged but innovative in terms of where you've got to. One question before a more expansive question: are you happy with the product?
Yes. I think I'm happy with the product because I was happy with the process. And I think often the product, when we haven't followed due Indigenous processes, are always a compromise. And I feel for this, it wasn't a compromise. And Jeff raised the wordsmithing. That did cause us, that was part of the process that also caused stress, that Indigenous standards are a little bit longer, but they need to be longer for us to monitor them. And so there was a lot of having to navigate, because what using the Indigenous process did is it just didn't disrupt the AMC process. It also challenged them to think about how they represent different voices. And I think in that, also allowing us space as Indigenous peoples to go, we've got lots of different ways we think about this, so there's not a sentence that captures the hopes and aspirations of our whole community. But there are sentences together that bring together the hopes and aspirations of our communities. And so I think the Indigenous Committee stand behind the standards, and I guess our next real tester will be the when we roll them out for accreditation, and then getting feedback from the Indigenous assessors on that committee and the schools receiving that. And so I think we've still got some evaluation and work to do, but I think we feel like it's as progressive as we thought it could get to. I don't know, what do you think?
So I'm very happy with the standards as well. I think the issue of the specificity is the time. I mean, we had this discussion that there are some points in time in which, you know, AMC generally over its history has perhaps a very simple standard and then allowed an enormous amount of variation. And I think some of our early Indigenous standards probably sat like that. And you know, to be honest, we probably weren't getting the outcomes we weren't. We weren't writing in a particularly outcomes way. And so philosophically, the standards have, you know, some process-related components to them, and some of those are the Indigenous standards, because we know that without that specificity, I'm going to have those perpetual conditions, which I think are frustrating to everybody. It's not really saying that we're telling the school how to do it, though. This is around, you know, creating the conditions and the notes. We haven't talked about the notes, but, you know, there is, well, what does it look like to achieve this? I think it's very clear now how this works. And I agree, I think the challenge will be the first few runs through where we're doing a material change or a re-accreditation of a program, where we'll test it and how the groups work and so on, because, you know, the DNA of the AMC and its processes and the way we work through things is something that has been challenged in this, and the next phase is just as important as this. But I'm entirely comfortable with the fact that there are some variations in the word length. I'm entirely comfortable that there is some greater specificity in some things, because I will then have an idea of whether they have been achieved. And I think the next phase is assembling the right accreditation teams who will have the flexibility that we've been able to, you know, to do that next phase.
Can I ask you a bit about workforce? And Jeff, I'm going to ask you this first. We've now had 2 Māori deans, Susan, Joe, and we had Sandy over at Curtin for a while. Why does that matter, if it does, and how does it change the conversation?
Well, I think leaders, as I have with me here today, you know, demonstrate what's possible. You know, that you can be a part of any part of the kind of enterprise of what we're doing in academic life. That leadership, the language of your leadership, the style of your leadership, the connection. So again, if we go back to 2004, probably would have been not in the thinking that we would have, you know, an Indigenous dean, and as you say, we've now. I think where the workforce issue is going to be something we need to think about is how, and I know, Sean, you think about this all the time, we've got to get away a little bit from individual medical schools recruiting or poaching or whatever, you know, for their own. You know, I think we've got to consider that we've got an incredibly able workforce that's actually already there. How do we provide the opportunities for those to enter in whatever phase of their career, and it may be early in their career, it may be later in their career, but also that those positions are culturally safe. It's my impression that, as not a member of the Indigenous community, that schools or places, are very clearly seen by Indigenous as safe or not safe. And I think if you're having a lot of trouble recruiting, you need to reflect firstly on whether or not it's a safe space. And as many of you know, Professor Gail Garvey is a part of our team here and I remember, her, talking about this when we were recruiting her from Menzies, and ensuring that the School of Public Health has the right values, and how does her team fit in, and what's the physical layout of the space, and how are we, and they were, it's incredibly important, and we haven't always done this. It may have been that it's one Indigenous, fairly junior person who's not empowered. How do we make sure all of this works? So, we've got to think about those senior leadership positions, which we have now anointed as being kind of a particular part, an associate dean or whatever, and then what are the conditions? And I'm confident that we'll get there, because I think the workforce is there. I think the variations we see about the circumstances of each school and their commitment to it, I think. But I'm probably...
Suze, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think, if I think back to 2004, when there was quite a small group of Indigenous medical educators, and then think about our last time we met in Christchurch physically, about how much bigger that workforce is, I agree. And I think the original standards were designed about us, and I think these standards are designed alongside us. And I think that we're being mindful that these standards are being taught by Indigenous health experts, Indigenous medical education experts, but they're also being heard, and some of our recipients are Indigenous students. Whereas I think before it was almost like teaching Indigenous 101 to a non-Indigenous audience by a non-Indigenous person. So I think there's been this huge shift since 2004, and I think the standards are starting to reflect that. And I think in terms of Joe and I being deans, I think it's allowed, and Joe and I have only had a few conversations about this, but we're starting to understand the structure of med school, which actually is that equity can be achieved if you prioritise it. So if I put my dean's hat on, I'm realising that actually every medical school, if it prioritises these standards, can become safe spaces, but it needs Māori leadership. It needs Indigenous students to see someone like them in the landscape so that they can feel safe, and for our Indigenous workforce to retain them in different universities when the standards provide some scaffolding for our allies to actually know where the Indigenous giveaway rules are, because I think the standards actually articulate that quite clearly.
So with that as the substrate, and then I'll hand over to you, Philip, for questions if I can. With that as the substrate, what's both of your expectations of the outcomes of the standards? Do you think they're actually achievable?
I have no doubt they're achievable. They will require some change in focus for some schools. For other schools, I think they'll be absolutely fine. But there's some time to prepare. I think the sort of philosophical underpinning within most medical schools is there. Sometimes it's just creating the conditions. So I'm very confident that they're achievable. Will we have conditions? Yes. Will we have perpetual conditions? Hopefully not.
I think that they will be achievable if medical schools invest in the leadership to take these to the next level. And I also think that they will be achievable when, what I like is, in the standards we talk about recruitment. And I think they'll be achievable when we're not just looking at recruitment of Indigenous students, but we're looking at recruiting the non-Indigenous students being culturally safe. Because then it will provide a space and place for our Indigenous students to flourish. And I think the good thing then is we will create, through these standards, a culturally safe and cultural competence with all our graduates who will be able to address health inequity, as opposed to leaving that burden for only on the Indigenous doctors that we produce.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Philip.
Excellent, thank you, all three. So we've got quite a range of questions coming through. The first one I'll start with is from Ms. Petter Atkinson from Monash University. You mentioned taxonomy. In what ways do taxonomy graduate outcomes address and incorporate teaching and assessment of racism and anti-racism? Jeff, I thought.
Look, I mentioned taxonomy. The taxonomy was probably a level above that. There are many taxonomies, of course, within this, and it's really around the structure of our standards that now in a more linear way go from a kind of setting governance through curriculum, assessment, students, learning conditions and evaluation. We've used the racism word, we've used it particularly, and so I think probably it's alluding to another taxonomy, which maybe I don't know, but we have very clearly suggest, we're not reviling from the word.
That's right, and I think the new when we worked on the standards, traditionally the standards have been really holding to account the curriculum, but this way, in terms of being anti-racist, we focused on the systems. So when we looked at workforce and leadership and mission goals and values, the new standards are really focused on making, encouraging systems change, not just content change.
So the next question that I'll go to is from Kyle Ryan, AMSA Indigenous Vice Chair and AIDA Student Director. Looking at how heterogeneous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are, how does this fit with the priority that medical schools should focus on local Indigenous knowledges? And then how does this fit into a national standard?
I have an approach to that, which is I'd probably even want to push it a little bit further, that schools have an opportunity to serve their local communities, and they should. Schools can set their mission, whether it's national, but I'd actually say some might want to think internationally as well. I know you've got some international footprint here, Jeff. And that's going to be an interplay between local priorities, local engagement, local direction setting, with the interests of the heterogeneous student body and the interests of the students that they might want to follow as well.
I agree.
I think engagement with local Indigenous communities is a bit patchy with medical schools in Australia. I think it's probably stronger in
part.
Okay. So we are encouraging those relationships, which I think have come and gone over time. Overall, I said the lens was sort of social accountability. I think we are pushing the schools to say we're here to serve the communities in which we are placed. And, primarily that will be the geographical community. There will be international aspects to that, and maybe a rural environment and so on. But we are pushing a little bit more that the medical school is not serving itself.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, there's some really good literature around social accountability that we use to inform the standards based on this, around both the diversity within a community, let alone the diversity within Indigenous communities, around the need for medical schools to really consider long-lasting social relationships that have social accountability, as opposed to dropping students into Indigenous communities and pulling them out again. But what can we do to sustain them? So there's a lot of that evidence that actually, it might be a little bit invisible when you just read the standards, but actually was the theoretical underpinning of a lot of that wording around to do with Indigenous standards and social accountability. So it was highly driven by the research, which shows that medical schools throughout the world use Indigenous communities as educational tourism, for want of a better word, and that we think we're doing good, but actually we're not doing good and we're doing harm. So some of the wording within the standards is trying to really elicit medical schools to actually be responsive based on the evidence around social accountability.
Another question from Kyle Ryan.
Kia ora, Kyle.
Hi, Carl.
What were some of the contentious points when changing the policy, and were there any hard decisions that had to be made? I rather like those questions.
Yeah, they're great questions. Shall I lead off on that? I think one was definitely around process and timing.
Yep.
Because the disruption to the AMC team network was, I can't emphasise, we have talked about it, but it really was a really huge issue that really needed a lot of conversations and a lot of phone calls and a lot of Zoom conversations to navigate. And the devil is always then in the detail, so the wordsmithing may have required lots of Coke, Coca-Cola, to put, or high caffeine levels. Or high caffeine levels to push us through being able to hang in there with each other as an Indigenous committee and as the MedSac team, to be patient and kind to each other around the wordsmithing, because to me the wordsmithing was where bias, racism, discrimination came to a head, and the discussions on one particular word or comfortability with using words like colonisation and racism, they were really long discussions, and we needed to get to a place where both parties were comfortable and nobody was compromising. And so I think the process and then the wordsmithing, those were really tricky times. And so each word that you see in there is placed there with a purpose. And it might just seem really simple, but, I really appreciate Aida's feedback around the language use was really good for me as someone from Aotearoa because in Aotearoa we use words differently, and so you're not just dealing with non-Indigenous and Indigenous, but you're dealing with you're dealing with Māori and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island groups who use the language within our countries differently. Our medical councils use them differently. So each word there was sweat, blood and tears with each word. That was the least fun bit, but then it was the greatest learning. And then trying to understand how our Canadian and colleagues in the United States and in Hawaii use those words, and thinking about the international use of those words, and really having to come to a collective Aotearoa Australia agreement on the words. So there's some glossary behind the purpose of each of those words and the way they were placed.
So we've got a number of questions around notes. This one from Leland Bandler at Lyme. Could you talk to the issue of notes, please? Who will write them? What will be the nature of them? When will they be available? And will they be reviewed by those beyond the AMC?
Well, perhaps I'll begin. That's probably in my domain. So notes had been... hi, Leland, by the way. Notes have been an important part of the standards for many years, but they'd kind of grown a bit like Topsy, and they'd ended up being kind of big and little together, and, they weren't... and so I think it was around 2014, 2015 we decided that they probably didn't have the utility that we would wish. Clearly, the drafting of the standard is where we start, and these hard-won words and the notes have utility because we can change them all the time. They can be a dynamic component of it. So once we have approval on the standards, and there's still some more work, part of what we're doing today and other consultation, and we've refined them, then probably at the beginning there would be some drafting within AMC, within the MedSac and the Standards Review Working Group, and with the Aboriginal Torres Strait Island and Māori Committee, to start to say, well, where are the notes going to be absolutely critical? And I think in some of those word discussions, we did discuss, well, what should be in the notes and what should be in the standards. And I think there was a sense that, that notes didn't have the same power. And so therefore, for some of the things that we held too strongly, they must be in the standards. And so rather than shortening it to 9 words, we said, okay, it's all right that it's 25 words and we won't put it into the notes. And, I think they were also, difficult discussions because the notes don't. So I think the drafting will occur once we've got a sense of the standard. I think for many of the standards, there may be no notes or minimum notes, but I think I could probably identify 15 or 20 where we need, and they will, again, be a part of a dynamic process of growing them.
Yes, I hope that what we've, and as no longer the chair, so I have to look at the chair with it, my hope would be, Leland, is that the same process we followed through for the standards would follow through for the notes, because having been in the Indigenous medical education for a long time, the notes can sink or swim some aspects of the accreditation. And I think the other really exciting thing is in the past, the notes were kind of written a little bit aspirational in some ways, but actually now we have enough published evidence to actually make the notes evidence-based and quote Indigenous-led and Indigenous-authored evidence, which I think will really change the tone of the notes the previous years. But as the new chair, Sean, what's your thoughts on that?
I was just wondering if you were trying to get your citations up, because that's all.
Well, it's always an important thing.
Yes. If a process has worked well and you're comfortable and you've both been pretty clear about the outcome, as you've said, the feedback is mostly positive, then why would we go back to a different process for the development of the notes? So I think what I've also heard Lilon ask, not verbally you, Lilon, but the notes have been helpful in the past. So how do we help? How do we use the notes to get the better outcomes if that's what we need?
Yeah.
But process, yeah, absolutely.
This one's from Professor Eleanor Milligan, who's the chair-elect of MedSAC and also director of the AMC. How do you see the new standards building the Indigenous medical education workforce? I think a really good question.
I'm so excited about this. I think that it will allow our Indigenous medical education workforce to actually have a really clear stake in the ground within their campi when they're advocating for space and time and resource for Indigenous health. I think that's what I see as one of the really great outcomes that can come from this. And I think in that, I'm hoping that now then role models to other Indigenous health practitioners or people that are engaged in Indigenous health medical education, that this is actually a really exciting and sexy and fun place to be. I think if you'd come to the Lyme conference in 2004, we all looked super sad and exhausted and tired, and what I'm hoping is that these standards give our voice a place, that this actually Indigenous medical education becomes a culturally safe space to attract our future workforce.
I've still got a couple more here that are really interesting questions. So first one, I think we might be able to get through them both. In New Zealand, we also have a strong commitment to Pacifica representation. How can the lessons from the development of the Indigenous health standards be applied to increase commitment to Pacifica and other underrepresented communities?
Can I speak briefly to that?
Yes.
At the moment, New Zealand is going through its biggest health reforms in 30 years. And as part of that, the Ministry of Health's Māori Directorate is running a project around anti-racism, because our new health system is really focused on equity but also being anti-racist. And I was listening to a podcast series, and I cannot remember who said it, but in the podcast series, one person commented, and I love it. They said, when Indigenous health opens the door, that has been a really complicated door to open, we leave it open. And we leave it open for other communities that have been marginalised to come in. And I think in Aotearoa, what this, being part of this project with the AMC allows our Pacific communities to now come through the door because it's opened and there's some templates. It allows refugee and migrant communities, which have had a really silent voice in our accreditation. It also allows our diverse communities sorry, I'm not going to say our diverse, our normal communities that have marginalised voices, like our LGBTQIA plus communities, I come from Christchurch, so our Muslim community, for example, Indigenous communities are leaving the door open to allow and to encourage and to embrace our colleagues that have also had a similar marginalised, continue to have a marginalised voice, but also health inequities impact them to come through the door. And so I think this is an exciting time for everybody as we celebrate this milestone.
I really like the metaphor of the open door, because some of the early discussions we've been having about the standards, the feedback has been, that we're very pleased with the work you've done around the Indigenous standards. Now, what is the model? And I think that's that actually is our next challenge, is how we apply the principles of what we've done here to other marginalised groups.
But I don't think the open door's enough. So what you've also both described and I've watched is, and this is slightly overstated, but moving towards power sharing. So the hegemony of the old style medical educator in Australia, which used to be accredited by the GMC, or the BMC, but the British Medical Council, as a historical antecedent, there is an element now of power sharing, and you both described that quite clearly. One of the things when I came into the role, there were some documents that talked about co-sovereignty, and I thought, well, that's an interesting turn of phrase, and then started to understand that a little bit more. So yes, the door, but you've also talked about a culturally safe environment for which people walk through the door and into, and part of that is power. So I think that's, for me, an element of change too.
Kia ora.
So we've actually only got 2 minutes left, so I don't think we will be able to go to further questions. Thank you very much to the audience and the questions that have come through. I think there are some fantastic questions there. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Suze. Thank you, Jeff, for your contributions to this discussion today. I think it's been an incredibly value-add discussion in terms of the draft standards and where the standards are going in terms of primary medical education, and indeed they will go further on in terms of secondary medical education once we start that process next year as well. A couple of final other points from me. They are standards, they're not aspirations. I think that's really important to emphasise. And when I started at the AMC almost 5 years ago, the first thing directors said to me was that they wanted a new strategic plan developed, and that they wanted cultural safety, health equity as a central part of that strategic plan. That's up there, promoting Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Māori health, and ensuring culturally safe practice to improve health outcomes. And cultural safety is also a core value of the AMC. Without that value, without that strategy, I don't think we would be here today having this discussion. And thank you to all members of MedSAC, all members of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Committee, all directors for getting us to this point. Thank you.
Kia ora.